The Mercury from Lethal Gaming Gear is a great pad that I really can't say anything negative about. Just like the rest of LGT's lineup, it is very high quality, and the materials feel premium all around. The surface itself seems durable and well made. It is also thick, so it has some give, which always feel nice. But it still isn't quite mind blowing. There are certainly higher quality pads out there, but this is impressively good for $30. You are certainly getting way more than you paid for. The stitching is also great. It is almost level to the surface, so you don't feel a bump on your arm at all. The threads are also very soft, so it isn't abrasive either. Although this can actually lead to some fraying since it is almost too soft. So on your arm here, where it rubs most frequently, some of the threads will get loose. And out of the box, you will sometimes notice some snagging, but this will be entirely copy dependent. For example, my Saturn is frayed up a little bit on top here, and my Venus has a little bit of crimping in this bottom right corner, but this one right here is completely flawless. And even then, the ones that do have issues, they're all very minor and haven't noticed them actually affecting the durability of the pad. So the stitching is basically perfect. Now the backing is pretty generic. It is just your normal OEM rubber base with that classic herringbone pattern, so it will end up drifting a little bit. So as you use it, it will sometimes drift up or sometimes down too. And I think that this is because the actual pad material itself is fairly stiff, so it doesn't quite suction to your desk surface like some of the softer pads will. But still though, again, it is not that bad at all and feels quite stable. The drifting is very minor and extremely slow. I never actually noticed it happening. The only actual issue that I could possibly point out with this pad is that it doesn't quite lay flat, and this left edge here is slightly bowed up. It's not an actual problem since I don't notice it affecting the mouse, but it does look bad and it's just a little bit annoying. I'm definitely looking forward to the flat packed versions of all their surfaces because once they are able to do that, they should be literally perfect. So overall quality is just crazy good, especially when considered it is only $30. LGG absolutely owns this price bracket because nobody offers anywhere close to this quality for the price. It is super impressive. The actual surface itself also matches the quality and is quite good as well. It is a hybrid pad, which means that it is made out of a synthetic material with a rough weave. And in this case, it is directly modeled after the ever popular Artisan Hien. It's just toned down a little bit. Mainly because the Mercury has a little bit of a looser weave in comparison, which means that the fibers aren't quite pulled together as tightly, which makes it so that it is not as harsh, since the nubs are a little bit lower and further apart, which does make it a little bit smoother and a little bit softer. This does though reduce some of the textural feedback, and you will definitely feel less of the pad during play. It also slows it down a tiny bit, but this is super marginable. The difference in friction is not that great. You honestly won't feel it unless directly looking for it. But most importantly, it makes the Mercury more comfortable. The Hien still isn't actually bad in this regard for me personally, but it is definitely an improvement with the Mercury here, since it is so much toned down. I still will say that the Mercury isn't necessarily a comfortable pad, but it is more comfortable. Plus, the weave is slightly adjusted to remove the X and Y difference that you find on the Hien, and in comparison, the Mercury is more consistent in both the vertical and horizontal direction. But besides the small differences, both of these pads are quite similar and are both very high performing. The low friction synthetic fibers give a very fast glide, which feels quite unrestrictive. Slower pads in comparison have much more force that you have to overcome to get your mouse moving. Of course, it is still slightly present here. These aren't completely zero static friction pads, so they're not completely unstable. But it is still going to be a big departure from cloth and will feel comparatively much quicker on these small motions. Also, their additional roughness helps retain some of the stopping power despite the speed, since you can end up feeling it grab on your feet a little bit, which will help with creating a nice clean stop, so these aren't slippery at all. And finally, this texture gives a great amount of feedback, which helps you keep track of your mouse and how you're moving it. This, in my opinion, is the best part. Once you get used to this instantaneous feeling of responsiveness from the texture, it is really hard to go back. Smoothness is still nice, of course, and I do definitely like how it feels, certainly more recently than I used to, but the performance of texture is undeniably better. And I am a huge fan of these rough surfaces. They feel so good. It's this combination of good quality plus a well-executed surface that performs pretty close to an Artisan makes for a great pad all around. But still, I was personally underwhelmed, and it took me a long time to get into this pad. I've had it for months, but I was always so uninterested in it that I never wanted to use it enough to prep for a review or just use it at all, really. And even after forcing myself on it for the past couple weeks and discovering how well it actually performs for me, after discovering it is one of my best speed pads personally, I'm still not enthusiastic about it, and I will not be using it much in the future. To understand why I feel this way, we'll need to do a deep dive into the surface here. because there are some small differences here that really holds it back for me personally. To do this, we're going back to the can here. Now, normally I don't like overusing comparisons because they're not very useful if you've never used the pad you're comparing it against, of course, but they can also be a little bit of a crutch since it does hinder your ability to actually describe the feel accurately since it limits your vocabulary to purely relative terms. But in this case, I think there is a good lesson here about what makes pads good and help understand what I look for in a pad personally. So this will be the main point of analysis here. Like I said before, the Mercury feels like a toned down Hien. So much so that it almost feels watered down, I think I describe it. Like, think of soda at the end of your meal where half the ice is melted and it's sort of flat. That is basically what the Mercury is to the Hien. In more specific terms, the looser weave takes away some of the Hien's previous niche. This pad is so good because of its oppressive roughness. It is what made it unique. Its tight weave makes the roughness and feedback truly next level. Since each bump is so highly pronounced, you're able to almost count the peaks and values mentally as you're moving your mouse to help keep track of how much you're actually moving it. Slow pads end up doing a similar thing through applying friction, which does allow you to gauge how much you're moving your mouse by the amount of force you're applying. But since speed has less force, it's a little bit harder to tell since these differences are going to be much more minor in comparison. So what texture does is somewhat simulate the sensation to help it feel controlled despite its extra speed, now that the feedback is regained, but in a different way. In addition, this extra texture also helps to give you the sensation of your mouse sitting on top of the surface, which makes it very easy to get moving. Once again, there is still some static friction, especially once you break it in, but once you overcome it, it glides super easily, almost like it is floating, which does reduce some of the lag present on slower pads, where there almost ends up being a little bit of a delay between when you want to move your mouse between when it actually starts to move in game. So these things about the surface are what makes the Hien fun and attractive for me, and subjectively a great experience. It is a premium quality pad, of course, that is highly consistent and uniform, but most importantly, it is unique and exotic in its feel. This is why I want to use it. It's not necessarily an objective improvement like any pad will be. It is still just a piece of cloth, a very fancy piece of cloth, but cloth nonetheless. It is just nice to use. Which is really what you should always be looking for. Gaming is always more enjoyable when you enjoy your setup, and having confidence in that setup helps you focus more in-game on what actually matters. So it starts to feel real bad when you get rid of any of these things, because they all have to work in unison in order to make a pad as satisfying as a Hien, which is why I don't really want to pick the Mercury. But for actual personal performance, even compared to other options that I enjoy using more, it just works. This watered downness type feeling that I was describing actually ends up helping in game, since the looser weave is a little bit less floaty. Of course, that floaty feeling is satisfying once you start to adapt to it. That's why I said it as a positive aspect of the Hien, since it can help a little bit with small movements and helping them feel more quick and responsive. But I am more used to a more standard friction feeling of your mouse just rubbing up against the actual flat part of the pad. So this is more similar to the surfaces that I like more. And more importantly, I think the Mercury is overall a less distracting pad. I like how the Hien feels, of course, but it is almost too exotic sometimes. Since it is a very large departure from other surfaces, it can end up throwing you off at times. And it is also so abrasive that you will always feel it. Again, I've gotten used to it and it is not actually uncomfortable, but it will always rub your wrists and hand, so you will be a little bit more aware of the pad than you probably should be, which will distract me in game sometimes. Then finally, depending on feet, it can be a little bit scratchy. Aftermarket, of course, always fine, but some stock options can be, again, a little bit more distracting. So with the Mercury, when you remove all these things, it's just a pad that I don't have to think about as much, which does help it to be, overall, my most consistent speed pad performance-wise. It does so well to smooth out some of the rough spots of the Hien, well, both figuratively and literally, which helps in-game a lot. So performance alone, this is my number one speed pad, since I do highly value this consistency. Here, I should note that the first award has actually so far felt pretty close consistency-wise, but I will have to put a little bit more time in on it to just be sure. Since this pad is a little bit softer, it can be more forgiving, which can be bad sometimes, so I definitely want to lean towards the Mercury here. But just when I'm talking about consistency, for overall enjoyment, definitely the first war. It is pretty surprising that I ended up feeling this way about the Mercury in the end, because I was so underwhelmed by the watered down feel, and really still am. But after forcing myself to put in that solid 2 weeks on it, I really noticed that consistency it provided over typical speed pads. But still, that isn't what I look for in these types of surfaces, since consistent performance will always be for actual control pads, and I still just generally personally prefer those surfaces in general. And instead, speed will always be more of a for fun option that I'll only go to sometimes, mainly for a change of pace. So having a unique feel is very important. So speed pads have to have some pizzazz in order to get me excited about them enough to pull me off of using a more typical control pad. Again, this is why I love the First War. It has those same hybrid qualities that I have described in the Mercury, but it is fluffy and entirely unique, so it definitely has that wow factor, which pulls me towards it despite it being a type of surface that I don't typically enjoy. Also, I usually end up going to speed pads when I want a little bit of a higher ceiling, since lower friction surfaces allow you to move your mouse faster since there's just simply less resistance happening. So your aim will be quicker all around. Your flicks will hit sooner, tracking and changing directions will be faster, so you are just more reactive. That is how this all works. It will, though, be less consistent, but consistency is less important here because, again, I will just go to a control pad if I want to be consistent, since that extra friction does so much to reduce the amount of errors that you make. And there are just so many of these control pads that I heavily enjoy, so I don't see why I would ever go to a speed surface if I wanted consistency. So the Mercury just misses in a few very key ways for me, which is why I probably won't go back to it. I'll still pull it out for direct head-to-heads to compare two products against each other, but I don't really want to use it. So it'll probably end up staying on my mousepad stack, which is quite unfortunate, because this is still going to be a good pad for a lot of people. It is really hard not to recommend such a nearly flawless product, and if you are a true hybrid pad lover, this could be great. It is truly an exemplar of this category. And for speedpad fanatics, this extra consistency could be very important for you, since you don't really want to go to a normal slower surface where you would usually find this. And of course, it is dirt cheap for the quality you are getting. And they're even starting to have worldwide availability, so this is looking to be one of the best pads out there. Just not for me personally, which is pretty disappointing. I really hope this review can turn someone onto this pad that'll get more use out of it than I did, because it definitely deserves that for what it is. Alright, thank you for watching. My next mousepad review will be me simping for the First War, and my next mouse will be talking about the Vaxi NP01 non-S version. Super underrated mouse, especially out of Vaxi's lineup. Alright, until next time.